Hey Satterton, Mr. Dubik here. In today's lesson, what we're going to be talking about is we're going to be looking at the first main stage or part of photosynthesis, which is the light-dependent reaction. Now, if you can remember from our lesson yesterday, we looked at the overview of photosynthesis and discussed how there's two main parts of photosynthesis, which is the light-dependent reaction as well as the light-independent reaction, also known as the Calvin cycle. So today what we're really going to focus on is the light-dependent reaction because it's a little more in depth. So I figure we take a day and just focus solely on the light-dependent reaction. So here we go. So what I have below is just essentially the basics of the light-dependent reaction you really need to know. So for example, where does the light-dependent reaction occur? It occurs in the thylakoid membrane. So remember, if you're looking at a chloroplast, thylakoids are found inside the chloroplast. Remember that thylakoids are the green flattened discs. So the light-dependent reaction actually occurs on the thylakoid membrane of the thylakoid. Okay, so that's where the light-dependent reaction occurs. Now, how or what goes on during the light-dependent reaction? During the light-dependent reaction, chlorophyll is going to absorb the light energy from the sun for photosynthesis by breaking down a water molecule, and as a result of that water molecule being broken down, it's going to send and release electrons down the electron transport chain, producing ATP and NADPH. And essentially what ATP and NADPH are is they are stored energy molecules that are essentially required for the light independent reaction or the Calvin cycle reaction to occur to produce glucose, which is the main energy source for plants that they essentially need in order to go through cell respiration to make ATP for themselves. And then as a result, what is released during the light dependent reaction? That is oxygen, and oxygen is going to be released as a byproduct and into the atmosphere. Okay, so that is what we're going to be focusing in on today. So here we go. Now, before we get started, I've been talking a lot about ATP, which is adenosine triphosphate. And what I really want you to understand is that ATP is the energy currency of cells. So think of ATP as money. Okay, and what ATP does is it powers many cellular reactions. Okay, so it carries a lot of energy for cell reactions to occur. All right, so now what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at the diagram down here below, and this diagram is comparing ATP versus ADP, because in photosynthesis we're going to see ATP and ADP all the time. Now, what the main difference between ATP and ADP is that ATP, which stands for adenine triphosphate, has 3 phosphate molecules attached to the ribose sugar, whereas ADP only has 2 phosphate molecules attached to the ribose sugar. Now, what does that mean? What that means is that this ATP molecule carries more stored energy than does the ADP molecule over here because of this extra phosphate. Now, why is that important? Well, when ATP is required to essentially run a cell reaction, what's going to happen is this third phosphate right here is going to break off. And what's happening is this bond that is connecting these two last phosphates is going to break, and that breaking of the bond is going to release energy so that that cell reaction can occur. So essentially what adenine triphosphate is that it acts as a fully charged battery. Okay, and again, ATP is the energy currency of cells because it allows cell reactions to happen, whereas ADP acts as a partially charged battery because it only has maybe half the energy as does ATP because it only holds 2 phosphates. So again, anytime we're running a cell reaction, we want to use ATP because it has a lot of stored energy, and that stored energy is stored right here in the bonds between the 2 phosphates. Alright, so on this slide what we're going to discuss is the light-dependent reaction. Okay, and if you can remember, the light-dependent reaction is the first main stage of photosynthesis, and its job is to produce ATP and NADPH, which are stored energy molecules which are needed in the Calvin cycle to produce glucose. So what we're going to do in this diagram is discuss and talk about how we get to ATP and NADPH. If you look at the diagram here, we're taking place inside the chloroplast. So here, this double membrane structure is a chloroplast. If we move inside, you're looking at the stroma, and then moving further inside, we're looking at a thylakoid. So the light-dependent reaction takes place on the thylakoid membrane. Now, if you look at the thylakoid membrane, it contains many embedded proteins that I'll discuss as we get into the actual process of the light-dependent reaction. Now, where does the light-dependent reaction first start? And it starts right here at photosystem 2. Okay, so photosystem 2 and photosystem 1 are essentially embedded proteins that are going to act as energy harvesters, and their main job is to simply absorb as much sunlight as possible. And the reason they can do that is because they contain those green pigments called chlorophyll. All right, so photosystem 2 is going to be an energy harvester, and it's going to absorb sunlight. Now, why is sunlight needed at photosystem 2? And that is because photosystem 2 is going to contain electrons. And these electrons right now are not charged. So the one way that we need to charge them is we need to provide and give them light energy to excite those electrons so that they can essentially move down the thylakoid membrane. So step 1, light shines on photosystem 2. These electrons are then excited, and as a result, because these electrons are excited, now they can leave photosystem 2 and travel down the thylakoid membrane. Now, as these electrons travel down the thylakoid membrane, they're going to pass through several embedded proteins. And the reason why these electrons move through the embedded proteins and down the thylakoid membrane is because these electrons carry energy that essentially allow these proteins to pump these hydrogens across the thylakoid membrane from an area of low concentration to an area of high concentration. Okay, so essentially electrons moving down the thylakoid membrane allows these embedded proteins to pump hydrogens from the stroma to the thylakoid space. And we'll talk about that importance later on when we talk about ATP synthase. So just to backtrack a little, light shines on photosystem 2. Photosystem 2 contains electrons. These electrons get excited. Now they're ready to move down the thylakoid membrane. As these electrons move down the thylakoid membrane, it's going to give these embedded proteins the energy they need to pump these hydrogens across the thylakoid membrane and into the thylakoid space. All right, so once these electrons make it all the way down to photosystem 2, okay, basically they're going to be out of energy. So what's going to happen to these electrons once they get here? Well, again, it's photosystem 1. Light is going to shine on photosystem 1, and those electrons are going to get excited again. And what that allows these electrons to do is continue traveling down the thylakoid membrane with a lot of energy. All right, so once these electrons get to photosystem 1, okay, what's going to happen is these electrons are going to travel down here to this embedded protein. And as these electrons travel through and past photosystem 1, what's going to happen is those electrons are going to help reduce NADP plus into NADPH. And so that's how we get NADPH, is these electrons that are traveling down the thylakoid membrane are going to reduce NADP plus into NADPH. And essentially now what we have here is we have NADPH with a hydrogen attached to it. And again, that hydrogen carries a lot of energy needed for the Calvin cycle. So that's how we get NADPH. Now let's talk about how we get ATP. So as these excited electrons travel through and down the thylakoid membrane, what that's going to allow is it's going to allow these embedded proteins to get the energy to allow hydrogen ions to pass through the thylakoid membrane into the thylakoid space. And the reason why we want a high concentration of hydrogen ions inside the thylakoid space is because these hydrogen ions are going to travel through the ATP synthase to convert ADP into ATP. Now, how do they do that? This ATP synthase, and if you break down the word ATP synthase, ATP means adenosine triphosphate, and synthase means to synthesize something or to make. So what are we making at the ATP synthase? We're making ATP. So to backtrack a little, these hydrogen ions, okay, are going to travel through the ATP synthase, and what they're going to do is they're going to act as a rotor and they're going to turn. And as they turn, what they're going to do is they're going to take an ADP molecule, and as they take that ADP molecule, they're going to attach a phosphate group to ADP to make ATP. And again, what allows or initiates that process, it's these hydrogen ions moving through ATP synthase. Okay, so that's how we make ATP. We take these hydrogen ions, put them through the ATP synthase, and what that does is it converts ADP into ATP by adding this extra phosphate to it. Okay, so that is how we get ATP. So now what we have to do is we have to talk about how are these electrons being replenished to keep this process going so that we can produce NADPH and ATP. So if you can remember, the reactants for the light-dependent reaction are light as well as water. So we haven't talked about the importance of water in the light-dependent reaction, and this is where water plays a key role. So when these electrons get excited and leave photosystem 2, what's going to happen is the thylakoid is going to take a water molecule and it's going to split it. Now, once we have split this water molecule, what we're going to get is we're going to get 4 hydrogen ions, which are going to just be placed inside the thylakoid space. We're also going to produce oxygen, which is going to leave the chloroplast as a byproduct, and it's going to go into the atmosphere for animals and humans to breathe, as well as 4 electrons. And these 4 electrons from the splitting of this water molecule are going to be replaced, and they're going to go right to photosystem 2 so that they can get excited again and travel down the thylakoid membrane. So that is the importance of the water molecule in the light-dependent reaction. They're going to be split. As a result, what do we get? We get 4 hydrogens that are going to stay and remain in the thylakoid space. Oxygen is going to be released as a byproduct into the atmosphere, as well as 4 electrons, which are going to replenish the lost electrons, and they're going to continue this process. So that is where water plays a key role in the light-dependent reaction to keep this process going so that we can produce NADPH and ATP for the Calvin cycle. All right. Okay, so on this slide, what we're going to do is we're going to recap the process of the light-dependent reaction using this simple diagram. So if we can remember, where does the light-dependent reaction take place? It takes place on the thylakoid membrane. What are the reactants for the light-dependent reaction? They are sunlight and water. And as a result, once we go through this process, what do we produce? We produce ATP and NADPH, which are high-energy electron-carrying molecules. And what they do is they're going to carry those high-energy electron molecules to the Calvin cycle, and they're going to combine it with carbon dioxide to produce glucose, which is the chemical stored energy source for plants that they need in order to function properly. Okay, so that is the process of the light-dependent reaction. All right, so what we're going to do these next couple of days is really reinforce the process of the light-dependent reaction. We're going to master this process. I guarantee you. I know it's a lot, but I'm going to provide you with a lot of practice examples and videos to ensure that you really understand this process. But what you need to know is the reactants, where it takes place, and what is produced. All right, so good luck and study hard.